Good morning, everybody. Good to see people have been watching those videos. Hopefully they're a really good way for us to spend more time having conversations. So this morning, we'll just have the briefest of recaps in terms of the impact dimensions. We'll talk about the principles, and then we'll talk about outcomes, and plenty of time for us to have a pretty open discussion with me probably asking some probing questions as well. So just to remind us, what we're dealing with really is growing convergence or growing consistency in what impact means, what it looks like, and how we can go about effectively measuring it. So I won't go into the dimensions in detail, other than to say they really can provide us with a really clear way of measuring impacts consistently across our activities, consistently across programs. Overlaying those consistent dimensions are some consistent meta issues, if you like, for us to consider. Who provides us with the evidence about the changes and our contribution and so on? And more often than not, the answer to that question is the stakeholders affected. The other issue that we really do want to dwell on is this idea of enough precision for the decision. You will hear it so many times, you'll likely have nightmares about it at some point. And I'm sort of okay with that, in so much as I think it's a really important message to reinforce. Let's move away, if we have this preconception that impact management is always expensive and always has to be done to this high level of rigor. It's simply not the case. It simply has to be good enough, no better, and certainly no worse as well. When we're thinking about this, we really are thinking about that dimension of risk. Is it an acceptable level of risk? And again, IMP's website, the Impact Management Platform, has some really good information to dive deeper into each of those. So a consistent set of dimensions, a consistent set of impact questions, and a consistent set of principles that guide how we go about asking those particular questions. And again, from SVI's perspective, Social Value International's perspective, this is what we do. We co-create standards. We co-create standards against each of these principles. And again, on our website, you'll see an overview document, and it's in, of course, ClanEd as well. And there is a growing number of these standards. We have them for Principle 1 on involving stakeholders, 2 on understanding what changes. And by the end of this calendar year, I was assured yesterday by my chief exec, we will have standards also for principles 5, 6, 7, and 8. So a little bit of work to do still for us, I think, on principle 3. No, in fact, we have 3, but we have 1 or 2 gaps at the moment. But it's a growing body of evidence that is available for everybody to review and contribute to as well. So we have consistency, but we also have flexibility. The reason I'm such a big fan of these principles, I've been banging on about these now for about 15 years, is that they don't provide a one-size-fits-all or a one-size-fits-no-one. They give you inherent flexibility. How you involve stakeholders, the methods that you use is up to you, as long as it provides enough precision for the decision or the decisions. So let's move into the content looking around outcomes. We're really talking about things that have or things that will change for people. Now, all of your case studies that you've chosen to use are looking at effects, consequences, outcomes on people. We're not looking at organizational level change. We've all focused on an SPO, a social purpose organization. And of course, Kapow. We all remember Kapow, blending of karate, deep philosophical thinking, and supporting people into employment, ex-offenders in particular, being our stakeholders, our service users. I really hesitate with words such as beneficiaries, and perhaps we'll explore that in a moment. Now, I know you've seen this on the video, and I asked that question, but I'm going to ask it again. We have outputs, easy to count, bums on seats, number of people on a training program, number of workshops provided, number of hours. And as Florian has said, yes, it's not just in terms of outcomes. I think, my favorite question is, so what? Often ask it, there's a bit more to that question. You ask it in more subtle ways. It's not so sort of nasty, but it hides so much power. Okay, so what people train, so what people are receiving any particular service, so what's changing, so what's different. And we can talk about, a sequence of outcomes. Again, I appreciate we've all seen this, so I won't dwell on it at all. But just to say, we are talking about this sequence of outcomes, and often that sequence of outcomes for people, not exclusively, but is often about skill or knowledge change initially, moving to more behavioral level changes. So I've got some new skills, I'm doing something with them, leading to what we would call those well-defined outcomes, which are often things around how people feel. They feel different in a particular way. Now, the outcome we have here is they feel greater level of satisfaction, essentially, with their job. And it will go further. We know this, it will go further. For some stakeholder segments, that's where they'll stop. For others, they could talk to us about impacts or changes rather on family, relationships, health, and so forth. This is the beauty of principle number one, to involve stakeholders. I have absolutely no idea what these stakeholders will tell me until I engage with them. But some do not. Some do not necessarily gain the new skills or do not gain the skills to a sufficient level. So become more depressed and perhaps reoffend. So Jesper, my question to you, and it is the question I asked during the video, is, are we accountable? If you are the manager of Kapow, are you accountable for people becoming depressed?
Well, the question is to me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Putting you on the spot this morning.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a hard question to answer. I think you can only be accountable for your activities that you do in the work, right? And you can't be accountable for other people's feelings, right? But you should be accountable for measuring that feeling, So
let me just jump in then. So if we're measuring, why are we measuring it if we're not accountable for it?
Well, I think it's a really good question, because I should be accountable for my actions, right? So whatever I do, I should be accountable for that. And if I then measure the outcome by asking the beneficiaries, then I am accountable for understanding their satisfaction of my activities, right? And I'm accountable for them changing my activities so that their feelings become what I want the outcome to be for my actions, right? But if I say, I give you 10 hours of training and the person still reoffend or getting more depressed because he has a life outside of my activities that I cannot foresee and I cannot change or act on, so that is that's why I feel like I can't be responsible for that outcome of that person. I can only be responsible for my activities and responsible for measuring the outcome.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to use that because I think we're talking similarly. We are responsible for the activities we deliver, and that's where we have the control. Now, I'm going to ask a question, but I'm going to go to Desislava because your hand is up. Now, my question to you, Desislava, is, are you accountable for people becoming depressed if you were the manager?
Well, I'm somewhere in the gray area here, neither completely yes or neither completely no. Maybe really the formulation of the outcome, becoming more depressed, is the issue here, because as the previous person that spoke said, it's a thing that could be affected by many other aspects of people's life. If it is defined more like if the trainee has become more confident in doing this or that, in acquiring this or that skill, then for sure we are accountable.
Can I jump in there? Because what you've just done is changed a negative outcome and said we're not certain if we're accountable changed it into a positive, something completely different that the stakeholder has said, and then said, yes, we're accountable for the positive. So my question back to you, Desislava, is, are you accountable for people getting a satisfactory job?
Getting a satisfactory job. Well, what I wanted to say, I'm sorry for not answering directly the question, with the previous thing is that it's not compulsory that it's a positive outcome. They may say they haven't improved their levels of confidence.
Absolutely.
So we are accountable for the negative outcome or for not good enough outcome.
Yes. Okay. I like the way you're talking about it.
So
yes.
That was what I intended to do, not to change the evaluation of the person, but evaluating really the things that we can or are more in our control.
Yeah, but what you're doing, is saying, I want to measure this. And what you're moving away from is what the stakeholders are telling you has changed for them. So the stakeholder has not mentioned, now they might do, of course, we might get this outcome if we were more complete. I don't know why we would measure confidence at the moment based on what our stakeholders are telling us. So stakeholders have told us outcome A and outcome B, and I have a feeling what we're saying is, no, I want to measure outcome C because that's more in line with my goal. But what if all of your stakeholders said, but you've not changed my confidence, you've made me more depressed? What we're now going to do is miss opportunities to apply principle 8, be responsive, and improve things. We've got to be quite careful.
Put in this perspective, yes, we are accountable. Asking the question what we can do to change things.
That's the thing, isn't it? Now we start to ask ourselves, what can we do about it? Now I will go to other people. I'm going to bring somebody else in, but yes, you keep putting your hand up, so I'm coming to you. But I hope you're going to answer that question. Are you accountable for that?
Last input from my side. I think I read this somewhere as well. So there are so many things that affects a person's life, right? And that's what makes it so hard to measure impact, because is my action, would this have happened to this person without me doing my activities, right? So you need to ask yourself that question, I think. And if the answer to that is, well, it might have, or slightly, then you need to go back to your activities and say, can I change the activities to get more outcome that I want? Or is it a bad outcome that I have by doing these activities, regardless of the other? So it's just my...
No, absolutely. I mean, this is where we are at the moment. The question is, are we accountable for either of those well-defined changes? And the answer is, at the moment, we simply don't know. But what the brain will tell us, what our cognitive dissonance will say is negative outcomes would have happened anyway. If you listen to what people say, it's, well, there's things out there, the environment, this was going to happen anyway. But when we look at the positive change, and this often happens, people say, 10 people got a job, that's all down to us. 5 people are depressed. Well, that would have happened anyway. I guess those 5 people are bad. There's something inherently wrong with those people. We're only creating positive change. So I raise this to say, we don't know if we're accountable. We have to go through those impact dimensions and those questions that come out around what is our contribution. So we don't know yet. That's the truth of the matter. So we have to start from that position of saying, these are our activities. Let's find out about the consequences of those activities. Let's find out about our contribution to those consequences. And we start to really fine tune or improve our understanding of what is material. So I just jump forward one slide to remind us, I know you've all passed the test this morning on what is material, but if we start to make that judgment before we have evidence, which is what I was trying to make people fall into my trap a moment ago, if we make that judgment that goes, no, we're not accepting that a negative change is material, what we're then saying is we're not going to manage it. We're not going to try and reduce the effects on people's depression. Or it might be a positive change that was unintended. Perhaps we're improving people's relationships with others. We've got to understand if they're material from the perspective of our stakeholders. Fadi, your hand is raised. We're now in, by the way, guys, an open conversation. So I really hope people just shout at me, shout at one another. To you, Fadi.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. So risk is always there. So not achieving 100% of the intended impact is always there. Whether we have the negative side, it needs to be measured and dealt with as same as the positive side to understand what happened, what's the root cause. Maybe we could have ended up with 10 depressed people, but due to our intervention, we ended up with 5 depressed people and 5 got a job. Or maybe 5 got depressed because our activity didn't pay enough attention to their social and emotional needs. So that might happen. And this is a lessons learned, so we can plan the next phase or the next engagement more carefully. So having always our project producing a nice to have and a good to have result, it's not realistic. It's simply a project similar to any other project. It has a positive, it has a negative. The most important thing is to be transparent about it. It's to really understand what happened so we can plan the next activity right. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you. I mean, you're absolutely right. We are never going to be perfect. What we're always looking for are, I mean, when you spoke there, Fadi, you mentioned so many of those principles of social value. I mean, they are not radical principles, you know, involve people. Fadi there spoke about understanding what's really going on, being transparent and improving things. I mean, that is being responsive. The principles are not radical. I mean, what's sort of half radical about them is they're all in one place. So they encourage us to really take a more holistic view to things. Irina, what are your thoughts in terms of this issue about accountability and taking a broader view of what is material?
My thought right now was, and I was hoping maybe for your input, is how do we get in depth in knowing our stakeholders' needs if we are working with many people, if we are addressing a big market? How do we find out this kind of, you know, subtle things somehow?
No, that's a great question. And I think, let me come back to you with something as well in a moment, because you're absolutely right. It comes again to risk. You know, what's the risk of making the wrong decisions with data that is not providing us with enough precision for the decision? And then we have to come to that judgment that goes, if this data is not good enough to support our decision making, and what we have at the moment is purely qualitative evidence. So if I was to say to you now, would you change the program based on this evidence? Some people might say, well, yeah, I think if I look at this and anybody becoming depressed, whatever my contribution, we should do something about it. But what others are saying, what I hear from you, Irina, is, well, actually, I need better data before I make a change to the program. So again, this is where we go into those quantitative dimensions. Whenever we're talking about this, we'll largely talk about using samples. You know, what sample size is good enough? You can try and get statistical significance if you need it. But again, it's always going to come back to professional judgments, where you as decision makers go, this is the level of quality of data that we need. These are the methods we're therefore going to use. These are the resources that we're going to need. Because so often we have a bit of a misalignment between people will want this level of quality, but have this level of resource, or be willing to invest this level of resource. If that's the case, the data won't be good enough for what you need. So you've either got to invest more or lower your expectations. So there's no golden rule. It really is, impact management is based so much on your professional judgments. Now, so is financial accounting. The difference between the judgments in financial accounting and impact or social accounting is we don't have the history, we don't have the legislation, we don't have this mainstreamed education. So our range of judgments, so Emma has her hand raised, I'll come to you in a moment. You know, Emma and Irina, you will make judgments and they are likely to be broader than if you were making a judgment in terms of financial accounting. So you will have to make those judgments according to your particular situations. But samples are usually good enough. I'll come back in a moment with a bit more, got some evidence in mind as to how we can help improve this program. But Emma, to you. Good morning.
Morning. Yeah, you may have covered it just then in terms of decent judgment, but I understand the danger of trying to fit sort of your measurement into your intended goals. But at the same time, if you do measure it and everyone says like, actually what's important to me is my mental health, but we're an employment organization, should we then be shifting our focus when there's other organizations that are better placed to be delivering these kind of services?
That's the exact sort of question we should be asking, isn't it? Okay, so we are trying to deliver a service to get people into jobs, good quality jobs, and people say whatever. Actually, the thing that's valuable to me is something else: mental health, reduced isolation. You know, whatever the change may be, you then have those exact questions to ask yourself. What can we do differently now with this insight? Is it a case of pivoting our whole strategic approach? And we no longer support people into employment, we become an organization focused on mental health. Now, that might be the decision that's taken. I mean, again, the quality of data to support that choice will need to be more rigorous than what we're talking about at the moment. But it might be that you look at the stakeholder profiles that you have and go, oh, actually, we could work with different people. So more of a tactical change than a strategic. But again, if we find that we make the tactical change and it's still not creating significant value, maybe we're doing the wrong things. I think we have to be open and brave sometimes to that. Now, I know it's a bit idealistic and naive at times for me to say this, and I'm very happy to take those stances. There will always be, for example, investors that want to invest in long-term unemployment, let's say, whereas we could create more value in mental health. Well, what we've then got to do is say, look, we're focused on long-term unemployment. Let's maximize the impacts that we can create within that strategic frame that we have, if we're not going to pivot and do something else. So yeah, absolutely the questions we should be asking. And that principle to be responsive really is about 3 levels of decision-making. You know, operational changes. What quick things can we change quite frequently? And we can do that with pretty low quality data, or low rigor, I should say, not quality, low rigor. Tactical changes could be on a quarterly basis. Strategic changes might be annually or even less frequent than annually. Thank you, Emma. So I've got a question.
Can I ask you something else? I mean, I think it's the conversation is really interesting, but I want to throw in something else, because when it comes to, you know, challenges or problems that we want to address by creating an SPO or something, it's mostly, and then we touched upon it, a very how to say it, complex challenges, right? And it can't be solved by only focusing on one thing. So one organization focusing on sort of long-term unemployment, not working on mental health, cannot solve the issue of long-term unemployment unless they also look at mental health, or, you know, whatever, motherhood and parenting, and there's so many things that you have to take into account. So my question is really, if you want to measure the impact from a multi-stakeholder approach, right? And when I say multi-stakeholder, I mean many different organizations, SPOs, working on many different angles of the same issue that they want to address. But the core fundamental thing might be one thing, you know. So how do you get about that, complex thing?
I remember our speed dating now, where you spoke about multi-stakeholder solutions to complex problems. I paraphrased badly, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, okay, fast forward, ideal world. Yep. All organizations are accounting for their impact. And you and I understand our piece of impact or slice of impact that we are contributing to for stakeholders. We are not there at the moment. You know, so coming back to reality at the moment, I would still argue that we can do this. We can do this with our supply chain and our partners. But I think we are at the stage at the moment, we need to sort of remind ourselves, and I'm often reminded this by some of our speakers who come to present with us, and I think Priscilla might say similar, we're still at that pioneering stage. the impact dimensions, when we understand contribution or start to estimate contribution, will help us better understand who those other players are. We start to do a bit of a systems map, essentially. So I identify that I'm working with you, I'm working with Fadi's organization, Andrea's organization. What we can then do, and each of these dimensions of impact should really give us some insights. If I can identify, and let's put it into practice. I literally had a conversation today with somebody where I was talking about stakeholders telling me about a large contribution from others, other than the foundation that was making the investment. Now I'm thinking, part of me, I go back to the organization and say, your stakeholders said 75% of the change was not created by you, created by other partners. For me, this is great. I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have, but the insights that come from that, and this is what the sort of quote unquote expert who I used to verify my results was saying today, is that he essentially said, look, this organization is doing some great stuff, but so are the universities that are working with young people, and they're not working together. So there's actually a lot of duplication in the system, and there's lots of opportunities for greater co-creation of value. So again, we are definitely not at that stage yet where we can understand our particular contribution. That's where we need to get to. Fast forward to 2030, I'm very, very ambitious. That's where I'd love us to be. But I think at the moment, what we can do is understand our part and understand those others that we can co-create and contribute with. Now, what I would like to ask, and I know I didn't answer that question in full, Jesper, so we can keep that conversation going, certainly. I will turn to Amal. I've got a question for you, Amal. Now, sorry, one other thing. I definitely accept what Jesper has just said. I'm not suggesting we sort of focus on one outcome. You know, it's not a singular outcome, that there'll be others. But let's say we've better understood, and this is the challenge that Irina just asked us, you know, how do we want to better understand our stakeholders, Amal. So going back to, and I'll put it back on screen so you can see it. Going back to that idea that some stakeholders are successful, let's say, get that satisfactory job, and some do not. Let's go back to our stakeholders and try and figure out something that helps us understand more about them. So we're going to understand their characteristics. Now, let's say, for example, we find out that those that get a satisfactory job have a strong support network at home, and those that are less likely, those that become depressed, don't have a strong support network. Now, we understand the outcomes and some of the characteristics that can help us understand perhaps why stakeholder segment A is this experience and segment B has a different experience. What I want from you, Amal, are really practical solutions. What are we going to do to improve the next cohorts of Kapow?
Everyone, I think we could involve other organizations, for instance, organizations that support, or maybe an organization that has a similar type of membership, so people, ex-offenders. In this way, they will feel less isolated, and they will have other people who went through similar experiences, and I can provide them support. So work with other organizations in that sense. I can provide that for them.
Absolutely. So again, you know, we're not saying that we can do everything and be all for everybody, but we might say, look, we have a deficit here. Where are those partners in what Jesper's just been talking about, you know, the system? Who else can we partner with? Thank you. Angelica, any other suggestions as to what we could do differently based on this insight about the difference between segment A and segment B?
No, I think that the partnering with other organizations, it's a good solution. I don't think Kapow would have the capacity to actually increase like that rate of support, network of support. Although there could be more like research in terms of how that support network like changes the impact or the outcome, and maybe identifying if there's something else that Kapao is capable of doing that actually can provide that extra value that makes the difference between one outcome or the other, so that it can include everyone. And in that sense, if Kapao decides to do that, one of the things that they could be included in the recruitment or the beginning of the process is maybe supporting these people that they also don't have a support network, so that that we can like focus our support and our efforts in even more inclusive way, and even increase more like the positive impact we're creating.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you remind me of a social purpose organisation I've worked with in Liverpool in the UK for scarily about 15 years now, and this is very similar to the insights we gained. They support people to get employment. Some succeed, some are less successful or don't succeed. And one of the characteristics that helps to help us understand that difference is around support networks. And yeah, this social purpose organisation, a social enterprise, manages people's expectations from the beginning in a better way than they would without this insight. You know, they tell people in segment B, you're probably going to have to work quite hard. They work with their supervisors so that they're a bit more supportive, perhaps in those first few weeks. You know, so they're a little bit late, they're not sort of, it's more carrot than stick, let's say, for a few weeks. Sophia, what about excluding people who have no support network from our program? Now, I'm going to fast forward and say we've tried changing things, and we've got 3, 4, 5 years worth of data. The data is as it is in front of us. Sophia, do we exclude people from our program with no support network?
Good question, I guess. It depends if we want to, I mean, is our goal to just take the easy route and just maximize our figures to say, look, we have been 100% successful in what we have endeavored to do? Then I guess that is indeed a strategy one could take. It makes us look good.
Yeah, I like the idea of having a strategy to maximize the effects on people's lives, not sort of maximize the manipulation of our figures. I think that's what you're saying. Not to do.
Kind of. Well, it kind of can be both, right? Because if we know how to be the most successful, we will look better. But of course, what happens to all these other people? Because they, you know, the cost to the system, they might reoffend, they might go back. So in essence, we've been successful in terms of the segment we've taken have become, we have achieved what we wanted them to achieve, but there's still a large part of ex-offenders that have not gone through the system, and they have not successfully come out with better jobs and so on. So we have, in essence, not achieved what we set out to do.
I absolutely agree with you. I agree with you completely. Yes,
I think it's not about excluding someone, but it's about setting the right expectation from the beginning, saying like, if our outcome is to get these ex-offenders to get a satisfactory job, we know by the data we have in front of us that to start this process, you need to have a support network from the beginning. Otherwise, we will not succeed with our outputs or our activities at the end. So it's not about excluding, it's about setting the right expectation, because we cannot provide for everybody. You know?
I agree. Yeah. We can't provide for everybody. But if you remember those impact dimensions, when we get to that dimension around contribution, what if we start to then discover that those which are essentially perhaps lower hanging fruit, segment A, what if we find out that there's a very large chance, a significant chance they would have got a job without us? Our impact, our score that Sophia was rightly talking about is going to be pretty low anyway. So I think, you know, we look to change the program. I hear what we're saying. We have limitations as to what we can do. I get that. There are always restrictions. But these impact dimensions will help us understand where we can make improvements. Just as we've looked at there, that characteristic of the difference between A and B, what can we do differently? And we are trying to increase the number, absolutely. Because as Sophia rightly said, behind the numbers are people. So if we improve people's lives, we actually will get that better number. So we're moving from being able to account for value better, increase things. We'll also be able to report it as well. So yeah, we move now from those qualitative, the two qualitative dimensions about who are the stakeholders, what are their outcomes, and we move now explicitly into measuring those quantitatively. So the first thing we'll talk about are indicators, that ability to turn the qualitative into quantitative, helping us to measure the amount of change, the depth of change per stakeholder. My promise is that we can measure absolutely any outcome, be it a well-defined, intangible outcome about financial independence, about levels of stress, about levels of loneliness. We can measure absolutely anything. The question that you should be asking yourself is, how can we measure that change, the change to the outcome, that will give you enough precision for your decisions? Because there will be different ways, different indicators you can apply to the same outcome. So again, the question always comes back to those professional judgments and to frame that judgment, the principles of that which helps us. And we look to our audience and purpose and go, right, which indicator or indicators, might be more than one, will help to influence the decision as we wish. So that decision could be to support an investor, a funder, to continue their support, to give us additional support. It could be to make a strategic, tactical, or operational change in the organization. So when we're talking about those outcomes that we're looking at, very specifically focused on our SPOs, we're very likely to need quite bespoke indicators. When we're talking about more program level or portfolio level, intermediary level, it is more likely that we'll be able to use more standardized indicators. The reason being that, we're probably creating less, the variety of changes created by enterprises front-facing people will be more variable than the changes we are creating. And again, I put myself in that category as an intermediary working for a network of networks. I truly believe that the changes, the outcomes experienced by my organization on network A, network B, C, and D are largely standardized. They're very, very similar. So I think we'll be able to come up with quite standardized indicators. The networks and their members will be doing much more variable activities, therefore more variable in terms of outcomes and stakeholders and so on. So what I want us to do is really think about indicators, ways to measure not just if a stakeholder has experienced a change, but by how much that change has been experienced. We'll talk about the ability to use objective and/or subjective indicators. And as always, I'll ask you lots of questions along the way. So let's turn to Kapow. Kapow, again, supports some people. They find jobs that they are satisfied with. The well-defined outcome is not a job, it's not income, it's a degree of satisfaction with that employment status, if you like. But others become depressed. So, Murat, how could we go and measure levels of depression in our stakeholders or experienced by our stakeholders? This is where I turn to somebody. I can see you there. Good. So, Murat, how could we measure depression?
I suppose we have to ask them first, but we need to put some. We need to decide which tool to go with when we are asking the questions. I mean, maybe we should first think about, do we want to measure them with in I don't know, as a Likert scale thing, or or some simple comparison to, I mean, to ask them to compare how they felt previously.
Okay, no, I like
and
that. I
now.
like the way you're thinking, because your immediate position was, let's ask them. So principle number one, involve stakeholders. That's a principle that runs through everything we do. So you're absolutely right. I think we should always ask the stakeholder to give them the voice, the opportunity to tell us how much change they're experiencing. Now, you spoke about using a Likert scale. It could be 1 to 5, 1 to 7, whatever it may be. So we have a subjective measure suggested. I've seen in chat, and I'll turn to that in a moment, that an objective measure has come in. Cora, to you as well, your hand is raised. How would you go about measuring depression?
Well, I would think that first we need to define what we consider that it's depression in order to be able to determine if we can measure through an indicator or using a psychological profile. So defining depression will be my first step.
You're absolutely right, because we don't know if we're talking about clinical levels of depression, and if so, we would turn to that particular kind, that branch of indicators, or whether we're talking about perhaps less acute depression. And I think it's reasonable to say, I'll just say it now, we're not talking about clinical levels of depression. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, that outcome has to be well defined. It has to be specific. You know, we're talking about low to medium levels, let's say, of depression. I think you're absolutely correct. Now, we have a subjective indicator, which is a Likert scale that's been suggested. Nora, how do you feel about measuring depression on a 1 to 5 scale, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if we are clear about the definition or about what criteria we include to speak about the depression that we mean, then we can ask about the level of agreement of the people. You know, if you have an agreement, if you have a criteria, and then you say, for example, on a level of 1 to 5, how, you know, lonely do you feel, for example, and then you have 1, not at all, and 5, totally, and then you have, and then maybe have this scale, and then different criteria, and you add them up, and then you have sort of a view of the depression, of the amount of depression. Or
yeah. I absolutely agree. I think, you know, when we suggest a 1 to 5 scale, 1 to 7, whatever, there's an issue about the validity of those results. If I say a 3, if Ernst says a 3, if Morat says a 3, do we mean the same thing? It's impossible to say. So as you say, putting those descriptors on the points on the scale gives us more validity. So 3 means this, 5 means this, whatever it may be. The thing I would say to be careful with is we're talking about depression, and then you started to ask questions about how lonely you are, different outcomes. You know, somebody could be lonely but not depressed, and vice versa, or both. I would say that potentially for stakeholder independent outcomes. But other than that, absolutely, let's describe those points. And just to say, Ernst put in a suggestion as well about, I'm not mistaken, you know, using a diagnosis by a professional. Yeah, absolutely. If that is required, if that is the level of precision that is required. So again, you know, a strategic level choice, one that's affecting significant numbers of people in a significant way, absolutely, yeah. But if that level of precision and resource requirement isn't necessary, then I think we can come down in terms of the level of rigor we apply. So for me, this is really, you know, this is what it's all about. We go, look at these different options. Which, if any, of these are appropriate? I've seen a couple of hands raised. I think I've talked for so long, people put their hands down, but the floor is still yours if you want it. Is it Christina?
Yeah, I want to ask if, for example, if we have to measure depression, shouldn't we take this outcome from, or I don't know, or at least or north in our company, no, like not like measuring depression. It's I guess it's not something that could, I don't know, but I would say it's super difficult for a company as how was the name, Tabu Kabu or whatever, you know, to understand the different parts that goes with depression with people. So I don't know, are we relying on doctors telling us this is depressed, this is not depressed?
Again, you know, I find my job sometimes, you know, you might think I'm being flippant when I honestly say it depends. And it depends on the decisions we're trying to influence. But you're absolutely right. You know, if genuinely, it might be that we need third-party expertise. You know, again, to Ernst's point, if we're talking about clinical depression, my 1 to 5 scale with descriptors is no good. It's not good enough. The data you get will not support your decisions. So if we're talking about that particular kind of outcome with that particular level of significant impact, then we need more precision.
And there's sorry,
no,
just
please
very
continue.
last. There's like a type of methodology or whatever to understand what's the significance. I understand materiality, it's a methodology, like making the materiality map. But still, the materiality is not like it's taking into account, I don't know if through materiality map you are able to really understand where should you be measuring, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question, because what we have done so far, if we take a step back before our indicators conversation, we can now, and perhaps I should have mentioned this, we can at this outcome stage, qualitative, make our first judgments about materiality. Are they relevant? And we say, are they relevant to our stakeholders? Are they telling us that this matters to them, it's valuable? Are they relevant to society? Perhaps something else that we need to include. Perhaps we've not heard about environmental externalities, but we know to society that matters, so we should include that as material. And perhaps it could also be material to our financial objectives. What we now do is move into the beginning of our assessment of significance, which takes account of all of these quantitative dimensions. We need to understand the amount of change, the duration of change, the value of the change, and our contribution to those changes. When we get on the value map, there's a free accessible Excel spreadsheet on the SVI website. You'll get your impact scores at the end. And then again, there is a professional judgment that comes in from your organization that goes, these are the thresholds for materiality. We might say all negative outcomes are material and all positive outcomes above a certain threshold, a consistent threshold within our enterprise, that's material. Anything below is not. That's what we continue to measure beyond T0. That's what we focus our management on. Really great question. No, thank you. Jesper, your hand was raised on indicators.
Maybe it's a stupid question, I don't know, but when it comes to indicators, I'm just wondering, are we talking about, you know, how indicators to measure, for example, then depression? Then if we define what is depression, then we can, you know, see from that definition, what indicators do we need to measure? Like, how many times have you cried today? Or how many times have you, you know, not got out of bed in the morning or whatever? And the same thing with having a job people are satisfied with. It's like, what does it mean to be satisfied? We can't just say, are you satisfied, from a scale to 1 to 5? Then it's very, you know, personal. But we can measure how many times did you stay late at work this week, you know? How many times did you get on time to work? How many times did you have a conversation with a I mean, very precise indicators.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
yeah. This is why we need those well-defined outcomes, those specific aspects of well-being that we're looking to measure. And you're absolutely right. You know, a scale of 1 to 5 for satisfaction might not be good enough in your circumstance. You might want to put those essentially milestones on. You know, how many times did you cry in work? I'm not sure staying late in work is a sign of satisfaction for everybody. You know, how many times did you voluntarily stay behind because you wanted to? But you're absolutely right. You can create, and you should all have the confidence, feel comfortable to create bespoke indicators that meet your needs. It is not something there are standardized sets of indicators. There's the IRIS Plus indicators. There are 169 SDG indicators. And what I often hear is people say, I want to measure this outcome with this indicator. In fact, no, I want to use this indicator before even knowing what we need to measure, the what, the outcomes. And then it's really a case of having the conversation we are having now going, which is the best way of doing this? Which is good enough? Sophia.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I mean, measuring this kind of level of depression for these people, if we talk about the specific example, you know, all the different details as to, you know, how many times did you, you know, didn't you get out of bed, and how many times did you cry today, and things like this. Is this really very relevant in this example in terms of, do we need to understand the level of depression, or do we need to understand that not getting a job gets people down? Duh. I mean, that kind of is obvious. So what can we do?
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's always the case, isn't it? Of going, principle number 8, be responsive. What can we do to fix it? So in order to know whether we need to fix it, we've got to figure out if it's material. I'll come to you in a moment, Anna, I promise. I just want to push into this slide here, which is talking about different ways of measuring subjectively, you know, the opinion of the subject. You know, Morat started by saying, let's ask people. Absolutely. Let's ask stakeholders. But it's not enough to say, and we're using stress, depression here, you know, yes or no, have you been stressed? It doesn't give us the insights that we need. What we really need to know is the amount of depression. We'll say it's depression. Because if we find out that segment A are more or less depressed than segment B, and again, we understand the characteristics of those segments, we can start to go, well, this group, they're stressed, but they're okay with it. This group, it's a problem. It's a risk. What can we do differently? So we need to go into scale questions, understanding the amount or depth of change. And as we've already heard, 1 to 5, probably not rigorous enough. We probably want to at least describe the points on the scale, create those milestones. And we might also want to ask more than one question, a series of validated or descriptive questions. So, you know, whether it is, how often have you cried today? Or, you know, how often have you stayed behind work? Just as an example, and then I come to Anna, this is not me saying this is the option to use, but this is an option. You might be familiar with it. It's the short version of the Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, SWEMWEBS. It's academically tested. That must mean it's perfect. No, it's still a subjective measure, but it's got a lot of evidence behind it that it's pretty good. Now, again, I'm not saying we should use this to measure mental health, depression, or self-esteem. It's reasonably applicable to all. But instead of asking, you know, how often have you cried, notice that the statements are positive. I've been feeling optimistic. So we're reducing some of the stigma that we could also attach. Never ask somebody if they're depressed. If they are, you'll make them feel worse. If they're not, they might become depressed. So we've got to be sensitive. You know, we're doing research. The first rule of research is do no harm. I am currently using this. I'm using this with a foundation here in Indonesia. They have identified, or we have identified, that stakeholders have a greater self-confidence, mental resilience. So we're using this. The minimum score is 7. That suggests low mental health, mental resilience. Highest score is 35, a range of 28, suggests strong mental well-being. It's good enough for the situation. And the organization said, yeah, we like this. This is better than a 1 to 10 or whatever that we could come up with. And I gave them a couple of other options and they said, no, we like this one. It's a reasonable degree of consistency. Sorry, Anna, to you.
Thank you, Adam.
Are you depressed yet?
No, you partly clarified some of my reflection about how to ask these self-assessment questions. But my issue is, how reliable is the data that we get from self-assessments? Or maybe what do we do to make this data as relevant as possible? Like, do we combine them with, you know, not only self-assessment, but with the assessment of our target group from somebody else? Or can you maybe just briefly say that?
Great question, absolutely. So, you know, we have to acknowledge we will never eliminate the biases within research, I don't even like to talk about research, with engagement with people. There'll always be that chance that we influence things, that people tell us what they think we want to know, and so on. So again, the question is, if this is not, and Anna, what Anna's suggesting here, I'll just take your example, this data alone is not good enough, fine. What other indicators could we also use? I mean, it might be that we just go, no, this one doesn't work at all. Let's find a different subjective indicator, and or an objective indicator, or more than one subjective. We could ask the opinion of other people in their lives. We could ask opinions of colleagues, supervisors, perhaps. And I go to, do apologize, I saw it come in. So Fadi suggested we could look at antidepressant use. So we have an objective measure. Now, I'm not sure we could necessarily get that evidence, but if we combine a subjective measure with an objective measure, now we have two indicators. We're increasing the level of rigor. Now, a word of warning that we shouldn't be searching for false precision. You know, if people start to say, well, let's have a third and a fourth and a fifth indicator, I think we're looking for objectivity and perfection that doesn't exist and we don't need anyway. But you asked the right question, Anna. You know, how can we not eliminate the subjectivity, but how can we manage it to a point that we say, this is good enough, let's use that data. So again, it comes down to which indicator or indicators do we want to use? Do we need to use? And I would always start from a position of saying, let's ask the stakeholder. And if that's not good enough alone, what other source of evidence can we get? What other stakeholders can we talk to? And can we get some objective data from our stakeholders or other sources?
And still,
So
Adam, if I may just quickly add, I guess if we are doing this internationally or cross countries, including different cultures, what I think Cora mentioned about the taboo. So these topics might be taboo in some cultures and others not. So if we are making a comparison between maybe outcomes of a certain program or intervention in one country and in another country, we also have to factor in these differences. So maybe it's not a question for now, but I'm interested to see how we can make this correction of the data that comes in based on maybe same surveys and same questions, but tells difference. Data tells difference because of the cultural differences and the level of taboo.
I mean, I asked that question to the Indonesian organization. Are you happy with this, which is a pretty Anglo-American measure? And they said, no, it's good enough. I think over time they will look at this and they might even start to make the questions more their own, more Indonesian. I think if we're looking at, you know, comparing across people, then we're going to have indicators. If we need that level of comparison, we will have to have indicators that are more comparable. I completely hear what you're saying. We've got to be sensitive to the different contexts. Absolutely. So these are just options. You know, again, I hope you can see where your activity is going shortly. It's going to be identify some indicators. In terms of, everybody's disappeared. I just want to make sure everybody's still there. Good. For some reason, everybody's faces keep disappearing from my screen, which is giving me low levels of depression, as I can't see if I'm talking to myself. So we have that positive outcome as well around a satisfactory job. So I'm just going to tell you how Kapau have identified to measure this change. It's not good enough to just say, do you have a job, yes or no? We don't know about the level of satisfaction. It's just not well defined. So we want to say, we have defined this outcome as it's a satisfactory job that's paying above a certain income threshold and where the person also identifies that they feel satisfied. So we have this objective measure of yes or no minimum wage. And I think actually that should absolutely be living wage. If it's below minimum wage, I would say it's an illegal job. So let's say I've changed that and said above living wage, objective measure. But alone, that doesn't tell me whether I'm satisfied or whether Desislava's satisfied with that job, just because you're earning a certain amount of money. So we also ask that subjective question of getting the opinion of the subject on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means not at all satisfied, 5 means absolutely love it. Or it could even be an emoji scale if you want to go that way. That's a descriptive scale. We have both indicators. So if I'm your stakeholder, I have to meet both of those requirements. I have to have a job paying above minimum wage, and meet your requirements on this subjective scale as well. Now, I said that your task very shortly is to identify indicators, but that's too easy. That's too easy. We can do that very quickly, and I think many of us have probably done it many, many times over. So what I would really like us to think about is a more interesting question very shortly. This is just a pictorial view of Kapow again. It's got our outcomes on there. It's got our indicators. We've got indicators for the outputs, you know, the number of people trained. So what? People gain new skills. How are we going to measure that? The number of certificates people get. Great. So what? And we've just looked at those more well-defined outcomes around satisfactory job and depression. Those are the indicators we've gone with, but we could have also included with the SWEM webs, we could have also included antidepressant use and so forth. But is it, what amount of change is good enough? And this is a really important question. I want us to change the whole question that we ask. I don't want us to just measure an amount of change. I want us to identify what is good enough. What does good enough look like? So I want us to establish thresholds. I want us to establish targets for social changes. You have them for your financial performance. Imagine not having financial targets. Think of the risks of not having financial targets. Your organization probably wouldn't last very long. The risk is significant. Social impact targets, the risk is significant. We are not, I say you, we, not creating enough impact for our stakeholders, not meeting their needs, not creating meaningful and sustainable change. So I have 5 minutes left before we go into an activity. So I'm going to play one game. Go to my register of sorts and I turn to Karen. Karen, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, you are now my manager. We're both working for a social purpose organization and it's come to a reporting period. Okay, let's say annual reporting period. I'm going to present you with 3 different scenarios. But the first thing to say is for each scenario that we have set a threshold. This is a minimum expectation of change. So the minimum expectation of change is 3. We're using an arbitrary scale of 1 to 10. 10 is great, 1 is not good. Okay, the amount of change. Threshold, minimum expectation is 3. Our target is 6. So that's more ambitious. We want an ambitious target. Scenario A, Karen, says, I'm delivering a performance level of 8. How does our conversation go? Remember, you're the boss. I'm coming to you going, I've hit 8.
So you've exceeded the target.
Absolutely. I wanted more of a smile on your face. I wanted you to start talking to me about bonuses and promotions and bigger offices.
Bigger offices, Adam.
Trying to think of what people get if they get bonuses.
So we're talking just about scenario.
Scenario A, yeah. Can I ask why you're not so congratulatory?
Well, it's not. I'm absolutely delighted, Adam, with your achievement, given that our threshold was 3 and you've achieved significantly above that. So am I asking you questions?
Well, I'm just interested in your sort of response to these results. You can ask
how does that relate to financial?
Oh, well, the financial, yeah, don't worry about that. We're just talking about social at the moment.
Okay.
I've also hit my financial targets. You're right, we need those.
Financial.
Yeah, we definitely.
Okay, so their performance and the individuals, their outcomes and the performance. Sorry, I'm not understanding. I suppose if I'm being honest, Adam, I'm not.
No, so if we just go across the top, so scenario A, you wanted at least 3. Your actual target for me was 6. I know these are arbitrary numbers on a scale of 1 to 10, but my performance level is 8. I mean, imagine this one. Okay, let's do this as financial performance. My financial performance is 8. My target was 6. What do you say to me?
Well, I would be asking how you achieved it for a start.
Hard work.
And I suppose thinking about the individuals concerned, whether it was reasonably easy to achieve that performance. So, given an example, if they were not too far from the labour market that you were working with them, could that have happened anyway, that they secured a job?
I like what you're asking, because what we're really asking is the target appropriate as well? Maybe the target wasn't stretching me. The threshold seems very low. Maybe the threshold and target should have been higher, because I think, next year, if I know I can breeze to a performance level of 8, you should be hitting me with a target of 9, really trying to keep me giving more, always looking for those opportunities. Let's go to scenario B. Same threshold, same target, different actual performance level. Now, how does our conversation go?
So did you ask for me as well?
Yeah, you're remaining my manager. I want to see how the conversation goes. Sorry.
I suppose one thing is the target realistic. You underperformed. The performance was slightly lower than the target. But again, that could come down to the type of people that you were working with, so the participants. So my question is, why did you not achieve the target of 6?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So why not? What did we do wrong, quote unquote? So what can we learn? What can we do differently? And it's absolutely the right sort of conversation to be having. And this is what social impact management is all about. It should be having better conversations. Let's go to scenario C. So we started with, I wanted bonuses. Now we're going, what could we learn? Scenario C, how does that conversation go?
So Adam, tell me, what was
let me sit back on this one.
Your performance. I mean, we had a target of 6, Adam, come on. This is, you didn't even manage to get that threshold. What happened?
I still worked hard. What was it? Who can I blame? COVID.
Okay, somebody has said, Adam, you are fired. I'm just passing on the message.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Dorian. Yeah, I liked you before. But you're absolutely right. I mean, look, you are holding me to account. Something's gone wrong. Maybe it's me. Maybe it is the environment. Okay, we should be reflecting that in our targets anyway. But maybe it is some more, another accountability mechanism, like getting rid of me or supporting me so I'm better. If this was financial performance, that's the sort of conversation we would be having. Done well, great, do more. Why not? What can we learn? Why are you so bad? Go away. But when it comes to social performance, we only have the performance column. We don't have thresholds. We don't have targets. So the conversation Karen and I have just had about going, is this good enough? Well, actually, we would not know. So when I provide you with an 8, a 5, and a 2, the question you ask is that good enough? And I go, I don't know. Just this is what I've done. So what we're trying to do with this is increase the levels of accountability we have to stakeholders. Now, your challenge is not just to identify indicators, but it's to think about how would you identify these thresholds and targets. So collectively in your groups, that's what we want you to do. We've done this for Kapow. What we're saying is that those that get this satisfactory job, we want 10 of them out of 50 to get a satisfactory job. We want them to receive at least minimum wage and report at least a 3-point improvement on their scale. The 40 who become depressed, no more than 40 threshold, and by no more than 3 points on our short Warwick and Edinburgh scale. So we've got thresholds for a positive change, thresholds for a negative change. There's one final point I just want to bring in before we finish. And if we think about targets, we often have this, the SMART analogy: specific, measurable, attainable, maybe aspirational, realistic, and timed. So we do need that time component as well. And this is part of understanding how much change is happening. So there's a few questions I want to leave us with. We're not going to go into them in any detail today. I'm going to hand back pretty quickly to Florian to bring things to a close today. But I want you to think about the duration, the sustainability of the changes people are experiencing. How long do they last? Now, if you were to ask your stakeholders, let's take Ernst's group, and we're talking about older people being more independent, less lonely, all of those outcomes. If we were to ask them how long they want to last, I'm pretty sure, like many stakeholders, they would say for the rest of their lives. So the duration, 10 years, 20 years, however many years we're thinking about. The question we then need to ask ourselves again as decision makers is, let's say the stakeholder said 10 years. Do we need to measure for that amount of time? Question 3 is asking us, well, how long are we accountable for that? And what I mean by that is, again, we talk about a positive outcome. What's the minimum amount of time, the minimum duration that we need to measure that outcome for us to say, look, we're confident enough that this probably does last for that amount of time? So it might be 2 years, it might be 3 years, it might be 5 years. I doubt it's 10 years because we probably don't have the resources, but we probably don't need that level of precision. Now, what we might do is come to, again, that conversation where we go, well, we found some evidence that if these intermediate changes happen and this outcome of independence occurs for the stakeholders for at least, let's say, 5 years, it should last for 10. But it might be that we just have to come to a professional judgment that goes 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, feels good enough. If you're not happy that it's too risky, then you probably have to measure for a longer period of time. And the final question I want to leave you with is, how often, how frequently should we be measuring social impacts as well? So we're not just measuring the longer term, the well-defined change, we're measuring all points on the sequence of outcomes. Again, you've heard this analogy so often from me. Social accounting has the same purpose as financial accounting. It's to support decision-making and to manage risk. The risk that it goes wrong, we make the wrong choices. That's why we measure our financial performance daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, at the absolute least. We don't just measure our financial performance once a year. The risk of doing that is significant. By the time we get there, we realize we're bankrupt, and then I get sacked or even brought back to the UK. Nice people. So let's think about the same for social impacts. If we measure at least quarterly, and we've set targets for each of those quarters, we can look at this and go, oh, the stakeholder wanted a 3-point change and we've hit a 2. What can we do differently? Because we're far less likely now to hit that annual target. But if we wait, and as I did with Karen, present that performance of 2, we should have caught that. We should have caught that 9 months ago, 6 months ago. Whenever we saw that direction of travel wasn't online, we shouldn't just be reporting annually. It was far too late. Be responsive says make changes when they're necessary, when we get that data. So again, I promise this is not all massively intensive. First year, T0, yeah, we've got to go through this whole social value SROI process. T1, next year, we start to just ask a question about how much change frequently, but it's one question per outcome. How much change has happened? 3, but we wanted 4. What can we do different? Oh, we've hit 3. That was our target. Great, let's keep going. All about insights that are generated from this. I know it's easy to say in principle, but I promise we can also do it in practice.